Racist woman set her dogs on Big Shaq just for being black. But what happened next didn't end in blood. It shattered a legacy. In a town built on quiet hate, Big Shaq didn't fight back with fury. He knelt, and the world stood still. The dogs stopped. The silence broke. And what Big Shaq did next, it didn't just shock the town, it shook the world. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The town of Ridgway Valley wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find a man like Shaquille O'Neal, tucked between faded hills and whispering fields. It was the sort of American town where time seemed to stroll rather than rush. A place where folks still sat on porches with lemonade and glanced up at passing cars like they were secrets, trying to speed by unnoticed. And it was here, of all places, that the man known to the world as Big Shaq had chosen to plant new roots, not for a comeback, not for a spotlight, but for something quieter, something deeper. Shaq had bought the old Millard County schoolhouse, a brick building with sagging bones and a forgotten plaque, and begun transforming it into a youth center. No big PR team, no grand opening gala, just a handwritten sign taped to the front door that read, "Everyone's welcome, even if you don't believe it yet." It didn't take long for word to spread, not just that Shaquille O'Neal had moved into town, but that he was walking the streets like a neighbor, shopping at the same dusty grocer, helping load boxes into truck beds, laughing with little kids, like he wasn't 7 feet tall and carved out of basketball mythology. But Ridgway Valley was a town built on old habits, and habits die slow. People smiled when Shaq passed, but there was a stiffness to it, like politeness worn as armor. Some waved, some crossed the street. A few older residents peered through curtains and whispered names from decades ago. Stories passed down not in books, but in silences and sideways glances. Shaq noticed. He always did, but he didn't flinch from it, didn't challenge it either. He just kept showing up calm, kind, patient, like a river running steady beneath the surface. He'd take his morning walks just after sunrise, not for exercise, not really, but to learn the language of the land. To wave at Mr. Thompson who gardened barefoot at the age of 80. To drop off apples at Mrs. Callahan's porch. To joke with the 2 teenage boys who skated past the old church steps and tried not to act impressed when Shaq complimented their moves. They called him Big Man at first, then Coach, and eventually just not because he corrected them, but because he never made them feel small. Yet even with the good, there were undercurrents. People started noticing the whispers. How the diner fell quiet when Shaq walked in. How certain families kept their distance. And how the pastor at New Grace Church, a man named Reverend Kane, would greet everyone with a handshake. Except Shaq, who only ever got a nod. It wasn't loud. It wasn't open. But it was there. A tension stitched into the seams of Ridgway, as if the ground itself hadn't fully decided whether to welcome him or warn him. There was one incident in the local hardware store that stuck in people's minds. Shaq had gone in for wood sealant. He was rebuilding a bench with the local kids, and the cashier, a young man named Levi, had paused, looked over his shoulder and said, "You sure you're at the right place, sir?" Shaq had smiled, not wide, just enough. If this is where kindness is sold, I must be. He didn't say another word, just paid in cash, tipped the kid a 10, and walked out slower than he came in. Levi didn't meet his eyes again, but others saw, and they remembered. What few realized was that Ridgway Valley wasn't just a dot on a map for Shaq. It was personal. His mother, Lucille, had once lived 2 counties over, back when she was still a teenager, escaping George's weight. She'd told him stories about these hills, about the roads that wound like memory, about the places you could be seen, and still not be known. Shaq came here not just to give, but to understand something buried, not in the town's soil, but in his own family's legacy. He moved into a modest single-story house with a wide porch and a creaking screen door. No gate. No guards. Just trust. The lawn wasn't perfect. The paint peeled in places, but it felt honest. Neighbors sometimes drove by slowly, expecting the mansion treatment, expecting cameras, but all they saw was Shaq fixing his mailbox, talking to a crow that sat on his roof every morning like it had stories to tell, or reading quietly with kids sprawled across the porch, their heads on basketballs instead of pillows. There was something disarming about him, not because he tried to be small, but because he never used his largeness to dominate. A man like him could command attention with a flick of a finger. Instead, he listened more than he spoke. When a boy named Jace told him he didn't have a dad and didn't care to have one, Shaq didn't offer advice. He just handed him a basketball and said, "Shoot until you don't feel angry. Then we'll talk." Still, the warmth of his presence didn't melt every wall. There were places in Ridgeway that didn't change. Properties where signs warned "private" in bold letters, with cameras disguised as birdhouses. One of those places stood just beyond the youth center. A cold, sprawling lot, hidden behind a 12-foot wooden fence. The grass never seemed mowed. The paint on the mailbox was fresh, but the gate rusted like a memory trying to erase itself. It belonged to Meredith Langley, and though she hadn't spoken a word to Shaq since his arrival, she'd watched him, eyes behind lace curtains, movements measured. The town said she hadn't left her property in years, that she had money, history, influence, that her father had once been the mayor, and her mother had burned every photo of him after the war. Shaq had tried once, just once, to wave. She didn't return it, just stepped back behind the curtain like a ghost who wasn't ready to be exorcised. That should have been the end of it. Just a cold stare exchanged across a fence. But something hung in the air around that house. Not just suspicion, something else. A weight, the kind that settles before a storm. And while Shaq didn't fear storms, he'd learned long ago, the most dangerous ones weren't loud. They built slowly, silently, in places where silence had become tradition. He didn't know it yet, but the past he'd come to understand was about to reach for him. Not through fists or fire, but through teeth bared in the sun, through secrets locked behind old wood, through choices made before he was born. And when it came, it wouldn't ask for his name, or his story. It would only see his skin. Still, every morning, Shaq walked past that fence. Calm, steady, unafraid. Like he knew, even if the town didn't yet, that you can't rebuild broken places by avoiding them. You have to stand in the cold, let it surround you, let it try, and then show it warmth, even if it doesn't know what to do with it. The youth center had only been open for 3 weeks when Shaq first took real notice of the fence next door. Not a casual glance, not a curious peek, but a long studied look, the kind that comes when something doesn't just feel out of place, but wrong in a way that presses on your chest. The fence stretched along the length of the adjacent property, thick as a barricade and nearly 12 feet tall. Most fences in Ridgeway were simple: picket, wire, maybe chain link if someone was feeling protective. But this one looked like it belonged in a war zone, or at the edge of a prison yard. The boards were a deep, weather-stained brown, reinforced with thick vertical beams that had clearly been added over time. New nails gleamed like tiny warnings against the older wood. No gaps, no visibility. It didn't enclose the yard, it imprisoned it. From behind the wall came the sound of barking, not yaps or whines, but the low, guttural growls of dogs bred for intimidation. They didn't just bark when people passed, they barked when the wind changed, when birds flew too low, when laughter rang out from the youth center. Shaq had counted 3 different pitches in those barks. 3 animals, big ones, always on alert. He didn't like how the kids flinched when they heard the snarling. Jace, the skater boy who used to act too cool for everything, now avoided the basketball court near the fence. One of the younger girls, Ellie, had whispered that she thought the dogs could smell fear. Shaq had told her that dogs didn't feed off fear. People did, but he didn't say it loud enough for everyone to hear. No one in town seemed eager to talk about the woman who lived behind the wall. Shaq had asked casually at the general store. "Miss Langley," the clerk had said, not looking up from his ledger. "She keeps to herself." At the diner, a waitress had changed the subject mid-sentence when her name came up. Even Pastor Kane, who usually had something to say about everyone, simply raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Best leave that be." But Shaq didn't leave things be, not when something felt off. He asked the property registrar about the land next door. The clerk, a thin man with crooked glasses, hesitated before sliding a single file across the desk. It was sparse. The deed had passed from Walter Langley to his daughter Meredith in 1992. No mortgage, no sale listings, no renovations on file, though clearly that fence had been fortified in recent years. Shaq closed the folder slowly. Walter Langley. That name rang louder than most in Ridgeway, though no one said it anymore. He'd once been a county supervisor, a man known for his silver tongue and iron spine. He'd built wealth on old money and older beliefs. The Langley estate had once spanned much of the town's east side. Stories about his treatment of black workers were passed down in hushed tones, but never challenged. After his death, the family vanished from public life, and Meredith, the only child, remained behind the fence. Some said she was a recluse. Others said she was worse. The first time Shaq saw her, she was dragging a hose across her yard. It was mid-morning, and the youth center had just opened its doors for the day. The dogs were leashed to metal posts, straining against their collars. Meredith Langley was older than Shaq expected. Her white hair was pulled into a tight braid, her back bent slightly at the shoulders, but her movements were sharp, deliberate. Her eyes met his across the fence line, piercing, unblinking. Shaq raised a hand, not an invitation, just acknowledgement. She stared for a beat too long, then turned and walked away, the dogs following like shadows. Later that week, Shaq walked past her house on purpose, not out of nosiness, but because he believed that walls meant nothing if you gave people a reason to lower them. He tipped his head in greeting. "Morning, ma'am," he said gently, not expecting a reply but offering one anyway. She stood at her porch, motionless, clutching the collar of one of the dogs as it growled. The air between them thickened. Then, without a word, she turned and slammed her door shut. The echo of the door hit harder than the growl. It wasn't just rejection, it was dismissal. Shaq told himself not to take it personally. He knew prejudice when he saw it, could spot it in a glance, a purse clutch, a too quiet pause. But he also knew that hate didn't always come in screams. Sometimes it lived in silence, in high fences, in watchdogs trained to attack shadows. Still, something about that property unsettled him more than usual. The way the dogs circled when the kids played music. The way her curtains fluttered just as he stepped outside, like she tracked his movements. He found himself wondering, what was she protecting in there? Or more haunting, what was she afraid would get in? One afternoon, Shaq stayed behind after the youth center closed, sitting alone on the back porch with a thermos of tea. Dusk was settling, the air cool, sky painted in lavender and gold. The dog started barking suddenly, violently. Shaq turned his head. From the corner of the fence, he saw Meredith watching him through a knothole in the wood, eyes framed in shadow, unmoving. She didn't speak, just stared. He didn't flinch. He stayed where he was, grounded and quiet, letting her look. Then, calmly, he rose, emptied his cup, and went inside. Whatever message she was trying to send, he wouldn't read it with fear. The next morning, a new sign had been nailed to her fence. No trespassing, no loitering, protected by canine unit. Beneath it, the edges of a freshly added padlock glinted in the sun. It wasn't about property lines anymore. It was a warning, and not just to him. The town began to shift subtly. The kids talked less about playing on the east side. Volunteers hesitated when unloading near the fence. Shaq noticed how the mail carrier dropped letters from the sidewalk rather than walking up to her gate. The youth center remained full, vibrant, defiant in its energy, but something dark circled outside its walls. Not violence, not yet, but fear, a kind of inherited fear. The kind that doesn't speak but makes itself known in gestures, glances, avoidance. And that fear had started to wrap around the youth center like a cold vine. Shaq had always believed that fences told you more about their builders than their boundaries. Some were for safety. Some were for control. But the Langley fence? That was history trying not to be unearthed. Something had been buried in that property. And it wasn't just old grudges. He didn't go near it again. For several days. Let it breathe. Let her breathe. But every morning, when he opened the youth center, he glanced at the gate. Not because he expected it to open, but because something told him, one day it would. And when it did, it wouldn't be an invitation, it would be a reckoning. Shaq had lived in the public eye long enough to know when tension was building. Ridgeway was changing. Not because he came, but because his presence disrupted an equilibrium that had gone unchallenged for too long. The fence was more than wood and nails. It was a line between past and present, between truth and denial, between who the town wanted to be and who it still was. And Shaq? He was standing right at the line. Not to tear it down. Not yet. But to let everyone know, he saw it. He heard the growls. He read the signs. And he wasn't going anywhere. The sky that afternoon was clear, almost indifferent. Not a cloud in sight, just a stretch of uninterrupted blue that made everything below feel smaller than usual. Even Big Shaq. The youth center had just wrapped its art hour, and a group of kids were packing up their paintbrushes, their hands stained in wild color. Shaq had stepped out alone to drop off some recyclables at the back alley bins, a path that led him along the fence, That fence. The barking started before he even reached the edge of Meredith Langley's property. It was abrupt, vicious, like an alarm going off. Not to warn her, but to warn him. The dogs lunged at the wood from behind, their claws scratching deep enough to splinter. Shaq paused only for a second. This wasn't new. The growls had become a kind of soundtrack for that side of the youth center. He exhaled slowly, adjusted the strap on the box he was carrying, and kept walking. Then the latch on the side porch door clicked open. The dogs didn't fall silent. They seemed to get louder, more agitated. Meredith Langley stepped into view with that same slow, deliberate gait Shaq had seen before. Her posture was rigid, her eyes sharpened like flint, but what struck hardest was the tension in her mouth. Tight, pulled inward, as if she was holding back something bitter for far too long. Shaq didn't say anything. He didn't stop. Just walked the way he always did. Calm, even, shoulders squared, but soft. She stood there watching him, and then, like a switch flipped, her voice cracked the air. One word. Just one. It wasn't said with anger. It was colder than that. Said like fact. Like entitlement. Said loud enough for everyone to hear. A slur. An ugly buried thing pulled out of history's mouth and tossed into the middle of a modern street. For a moment time didn't freeze. It recoiled. There were people nearby. The auto shop across the street had its garage door wide open. Two mechanics stood inside, oily hands paused mid-task. A woman pushing a stroller turned her head and immediately looked down. An elderly man sitting on the bench near the corner store removed his glasses and pretended to clean them. Not one word was spoken. Not a single sound followed. The dogs went quiet first, as if even they knew something unnatural had just happened. Shaq stopped walking. He didn't turn toward her, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there. The kind of stillness that comes not from fear, but from an avalanche of restraint. His back to her, his hands hanging at his sides, his heartbeat loud in his own ears, but hidden from the world. He could have kept going, could have walked that 30 feet to the recycling bins and back, but he didn't. He stood in that silence, not for her but for the town. Because this wasn't about a word. It never had been. It was about how no one said anything. How the wind carried her voice farther than anyone's shame could catch. How the town, which had watched him build, teach, uplift, now watched him be reduced to a caricature without protest. Shaq finally turned slowly, deliberately, to face her. Their eyes locked, and for the briefest second there was something unstable in hers. Not triumph, not hatred, flickering uncertainty. Maybe even fear. Not fear of him, but fear that he might finally respond, that he might push back. He didn't. Instead, he said nothing. He let the quiet say everything she never would. After a long pause, he turned and walked back the way he came. The dogs barked again, half-heartedly this time. She disappeared behind her door, slamming it harder than she needed to. Like the noise could undo the weight of what had already been dropped. As Shaq approached the front of the youth center, the street still hadn't moved. The mechanics ducked back into the garage. The woman with the stroller crossed to the other sidewalk. The old man put his glasses back on and looked the other way. It wasn't guilt on their faces. Not openly. It was preservation. That unspoken code. Stay out of it. Let it pass. Don't make it worse. Inside the center, the kids were laughing again. Unaware. Unburdened. Shaq paused at the door, watching them through the glass. He didn't want to bring that poison inside. Didn't want to let it stain the space they'd built. So he breathed. Deep. Counted 5 seconds in. 5 seconds out. His chest felt tight, but his hands were steady. He didn't tell anyone what she said. He didn't need to. Word spread as it always did in Ridgeway. The version changed slightly with each telling. Some claimed it wasn't that bad. Others said it was worse than anyone had admitted. But the effect was the same. More hesitation. More distance. A few parents pulled their kids from the youth center for a day or two, citing scheduling conflicts. The diner server who used to refill Shaq's coffee without asking suddenly needed to check if we have decaf available. Subtle things. Death by 1,000 courtesies. But Shaq kept showing up. Every morning, he opened the youth center, cleaned the brushes, laid out the snacks, sat on the porch with Jace and the younger kids, talking about superheroes, life, hope. He didn't mention Meredith, didn't bring it into conversation, but it lived in his presence, in the way he hugged the children longer, spoke a little softer, smiled a little slower, not from weakness, from depth. What hurt most wasn't the slur. Shaq had heard worse in his youth. It was the quiet that followed it. The willing silence of people who should have said something, who could have drawn a line and chose not to. Ridgway had a soul problem. Not overt racism. Something trickier, comfortable apathy. The kind that dresses up in manners and hides behind fences. That night, as Shaq sat alone in the office behind the youth center, he pulled out an old journal his mother had given him. Inside was a note she'd once written. When people try to shrink you, let your light be louder than their words. He read it twice, then wrote a single line beneath it. What's the cost of silence when you can afford the truth? He didn't write Meredith's name. He didn't write about the dogs or the fence. He wrote about courage, about what it meant to hold space when others ran, to occupy dignity when others chose decay. That moment on the sidewalk, it hadn't broken him. It had revealed something. Not about her, about them, about the town, about what still festered beneath Ridgway's quiet smiles and old buildings. And for the first time since he arrived, Shaq realized this wasn't just a place to give back. It was a place to uncover. It started like 100 other mornings. Shaq was carrying a box of donated books down the sidewalk, the weight easy in his arms, though his thoughts were heavier than usual. The air was sharp, the kind that hinted at early spring trying to push winter out of the way. The sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to soften the light, so everything still held that silver-blue edge. Kids were gathering at the youth center, dragging backpacks and skateboards, their laughter the only real music in a town that often preferred silence. Shaq had just reached the rear entrance, when a sound cut across the street. Not a bark, not a growl, but the sharp, metallic creak of a gate, hinge long unused. He stopped, slowly turned. Meredith Langley's gate, that fortress-like slab of wood and rusted iron, stood ajar, wide enough for a man to pass through. Or 3 dogs. And out they came. Not walking. Charging. 3 hulking shepherd mixes, muscle and teeth, bred for intimidation. Their paws hit the pavement like hammers, their snarls slicing through the air. The sound froze the kids in place. A skateboard clattered to the ground. Someone gasped. Someone else screamed. Doors cracked open along the street. Heads turned, and for a fraction of a second, everything hung in a kind of suspended terror. But Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he lowered himself, slowly, deliberately, knees to concrete, back straight, arms open, not wide, but low and steady, palms forward. Not an act of defense, not surrender, something else, something older. The dogs came within inches. One lunged and stopped midair. Another growled so deep it shook the pavement. But then, a pause, a shift, the smallest of changes, a twitch in an ear, a tilt of the head. The first dog, the biggest, stopped barking. Its snarl softened to a whine. It sniffed the air, paced once, then sat. The second followed, and then the third. In less than 10 seconds, the chaos turned to calm. They weren't panting, they weren't tense, they were still, sitting around Shaq like sentinels, not prisoners, watching him, waiting, loyal. Silence rippled outward. From across the street, someone was filming. You could almost hear their breath catch. Then came the voice. Meredith Langley had stepped onto her porch, face flushed, eyes wild. "Get away from him!" she screamed. "Come here. Get over here right now." The dogs didn't move. She clapped, whistled, called each of their names. Dutch, Ranger, Smoke. Nothing. They stayed rooted around Shaq like the earth itself had decided to hold them there. Shaq didn't look at her, didn't speak. He simply reached into the book box beside him, pulled out a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and set it on the ground in front of the dogs. Then he stood up. The dogs followed, rising slowly, but they didn't growl, they didn't snarl. They just watched him, quiet, listening. Someone shouted, "Are you okay?" from a few houses down. Shaq turned toward the voice, gave a small nod. That was all. Meredith was now trembling. Not from cold, from something deeper, something she couldn't name, or didn't want to. She stormed off the porch, shouting again, this time toward the sky more than the street. They don't act like this. This is your fault. You did something to them." Shaq didn't reply. He picked up the book box and carried it to the center. The dog stayed put until he crossed the threshold. Then, one by one, they slowly padded back through the open gate, as if nothing had happened. as if they hadn't just unraveled the whole illusion Ridgway had been clinging to. The gate creaked shut behind them. But the door, the one between truth and denial, had already been kicked wide open. By noon, the video had circled the internet twice. Someone had uploaded it with the caption, "Shaquille O'Neal calms attack dogs with nothing but peace. Ridgway, meet your real hero." News outlets picked it up before dinner time. By sunset, hashtags were trending. Shaq stands still. Peace by presence. Dogs know the truth. But Ridgway didn't know what to do with it. Some people celebrated. Some pretended they hadn't seen it. Others insisted it was a fluke, that dogs can act strange when startled. One man at the feed store said it had to be training, or maybe pheromones, or witchcraft. Anything but what it really was. The truth, of course, was less magical than it was ancient. The dogs hadn't obeyed out of submission. They'd recognized something Meredith hadn't. Something she wouldn't let herself believe. Calm, authority, integrity. The kind that couldn't be taught or demanded. The kind you either had or you didn't. The mayor's office didn't release a statement. The sheriff said there was no crime to investigate. Meredith filed a noise complaint the next morning, citing public agitation and trespassing via emotional manipulation. The document made no sense, legally or otherwise, but it was entered into record all the same. Shaq didn't acknowledge the video. Not publicly. He didn't post, didn't tweet. When a reporter called the youth center and asked for comment, he simply replied, "I just kneeled," and then he hung up. But that wasn't the end of it, because something had shifted, not just online, but on the ground. People walked differently around him now. The usual glances, the long stares, had a new flavor. Some were filled with awe, others with resentment. A few, and these were the hardest, with shame. Parents apologized for their kids' absences. The pastor from New Grace left a card at the front desk that read, "There's strength in stillness. Thank you for showing us." Even the kids noticed. One morning, Ellie asked if the dogs would come back. Shaq smiled and said, "They never left. They just saw what they needed to." The children didn't quite get it. Not all of them. But they remembered the quiet. The moment the growling stopped. Meredith didn't speak to him after that day. Didn't shout. Didn't threaten. But her presence dimmed. The barking became less frequent. The curtains stopped moving. Her house, once a looming force, began to seem like what it truly was. A place retreating into itself. Guarded not by dogs but by fear. And still Shaq walked past it every morning. Never once glancing sideways. Not because he was ignoring her, but because he had already seen all he needed to see. Ridgway had been shown a choice. Not through a campaign. Not through protest or confrontation, but through a moment, a kneel, a silence, a refusal to meet hate with its own reflection. And in that moment, the fence had opened. Not just Meredith's, the one inside every person who had stood by. Unsure of what to believe. Unsure of what side to choose. Shaq hadn't demanded anything. He just showed them what dignity looked like when it refused to move. And for the first time, some of them started to listen. The video had barely been up for 2 hours before it took on a life of its own. By evening, it had already clocked 500,000 views. Grainy footage captured from a cracked iPhone, but that didn't matter. The image spoke louder than any resolution. Shaquille O'Neal, a 7-foot giant, kneeling in calm silence while 3 snarling dogs charged, and then, inexplicably, surrendered. There were no tricks, no commands, no intervention. Just stillness. And truth. By the next morning, the world was watching. Comment sections flooded with praise, disbelief and speculation. Celebrities retweeted it with messages like, "This is what peace looks like," and "Big Shaq with the biggest heart." News anchors used it as a feel-good closer on evening broadcasts, calling him the gentle giant who tamed hate. Activists applauded his response. A few critics questioned the authenticity. Was there training involved? Did he sedate the dogs? Theories multiplied, each one louder than the last. But the video spoke for itself. Big Shaq, the peacemaker. Shaq stands still. Dogs know the truth. They trended for 3 straight days. Podcasts dissected the footage frame by frame. Psychologists weighed in. Body language experts broke down his movements, his posture, his breathing. Animal trainers swore dogs don't behave like that unless they feel safe. Pastors preached sermons around the moment. School teachers used it as a class prompt. What does it mean to lead without fear? It was viral. Yes, but also viral in a way few things are. Not because it was flashy, but because it was real. Because it said something people needed to hear, that you can confront rage without replicating it. But inside Ridgeway, nothing. The town, as if on cue, buried its head. The diner kept its blinds halfway drawn. The sheriff's office issued no statement, no interviews, no comment, not even a line of vague support or civic pride. The mayor, a man who once hosted a pancake breakfast, just because a local teen appeared on a game show, said only, "We respect the privacy of all citizens." Privacy, that was the word they clung to now, like a fig leaf covering what the rest of the world had already seen. Meredith Langley, predictably, responded in her own way. A letter, not to Shaq, to the town council. A formal complaint filed with a shaky signature and bold accusations. She claimed Shaq had trespassed, that he had baited her dogs, that he had psychologically manipulated them, using an unregistered technique that amounts to provocation. The document was a blend of paranoia, entitlement, and veiled desperation. She cited trauma, ancestral property rights, and community disruption. The sheriff filed it quietly, without even a follow-up visit. Shaq read the complaint once and set it aside. Not because it wasn't offensive, but because it didn't matter. The truth didn't need his defense. It was already moving without him. Still, he felt it, the way the town twisted itself to avoid reckoning, the way its spine bent, in all the wrong directions to keep comfort intact. He noticed the subtle reshuffling. The community board took down the youth center's flyers. The library postponed a scheduled reading he was set to lead. Local parents, once enthusiastic volunteers, grew quiet. Some wouldn't meet his gaze. Others offered quick, empty nods. It wasn't backlash. It was erasure. Polite indifference masquerading as neutrality. Inside the youth center, however, it was a different world. The kids were buzzing. They'd seen the video, some watching it dozens of times, mimicking Shaq's kneel like it was a dance move. One even brought in a drawing. Shaq with a cape, made of dog leashes, smiling like a hero from a comic book. They didn't care about the adult politics. They saw what happened and understood it in the purest way, power without force, strength through stillness. Jace, the teen who had once played tough, pulled Shaq aside after art class and asked, "Were you scared?" Shaq didn't rush the answer. He just nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "but not of the dogs." Word kept coming in from outside. Journalists from the New York Times, CNN, and even a French news station tried to get interviews. A talk show producer offered to fly Shaq to LA for a segment. A book publisher floated a memoir deal. Every email, every call, every invitation carried the same subtext. "Tell us your side. Give us the quote. Be the story." He declined them all. Not out of arrogance, out of clarity. Because he knew what they wanted. A soundbite. A symbol. But he wasn't here to be a symbol. He wasn't interested in performance healing or viral redemption. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was after something slower, harder. Change. Real change. And change never came dressed in applause. But the pressure grew. Not from the world, but from within Ridgeway. People weren't asking for the truth. They were asking for quiet. They wanted the noise to die down. The outside eyes to look away. The internet to find another target. Meredith had become a symbol too, though she didn't know it. Or maybe she did, and that's why she doubled down. She hired a lawyer from 2 counties over. Rumors spread that she was preparing a civil suit, claiming emotional distress. Her property, she insisted, had been invaded. Her dogs had been corrupted. But no paperwork came. No court dates. Just whispers. Just shadows. The threat of retaliation, not the reality of it. Enough to stir unease. Shaq stayed his course. He expanded the youth center hours, started a new program, Voice and Vision, where kids could journal anonymously and place their stories in a locked box. Every Friday he'd read them aloud during a circle session, no names attached. The first week, a letter read, "I don't want to be scared of my own street anymore." Another said, "I want to know what peace smells like." The children were telling truths their parents wouldn't. That was where the real shift began. A week after the video's peak, Shaq received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, old, faded, black and white. It showed a black man in overalls standing on what looked like the Langley property, decades earlier. On the back, written in trembling ink, his name was Jeremiah. He built that fence. There was no note, no explanation. But the message was loud. This wasn't just about Shaq. This was generational. Meredith's rage, the dogs, the fence. It was all an inheritance of fear and control. And maybe, just maybe, someone else in town was tired of carrying the silence. He hung the photo inside the youth center, next to the entryway. No plaque, no nameplate, just the image. The kids asked about it. Shaq just smiled and said, he believed in building, like we do. The internet, eventually, moved on. The hashtags faded. The interviews stopped. A new controversy grabbed attention somewhere else. But the story hadn't left Ridgeway. If anything, it had just settled deeper into the ground. And the town. It stayed quiet. But that quiet felt different now. Not like denial. More like watching, listening, bracing. Because now they knew the world was capable of seeing them. And so was the man next door who didn't raise his voice but still shook the foundation. The silence they relied on had cracked. And Shaq? He was still there, still walking past the fence, every morning, still showing up with books, and paint, and snacks, still waiting, not for an apology, not for justice, but for something far more difficult to earn. Accountability. He knew it might never come. But truth.
That he'd always chase?
Jeremiah Blake. A man whose name had never come up. Not in whispers, not in the library archives. Nothing. And yet Shaq could feel him now. In the soil, in the bricks, in the way the youth center stood proudly, on land it was never meant to reclaim. The letter didn't include an apology. Not really. Walter Langley seemed more afraid of his own legacy than of justice. If Meredith ever finds this, tell her I lied. Tell her the dogs weren't hers to control. They were trained to fear the past, not protect the future. Shaq stared at that line for a long time. Because suddenly everything clicked. The dogs hadn't been hostile because of Shaq's presence. They had been hostile because of the land. The tension, the snarling, the aggression. It wasn't about race alone. It was about memory. The dogs were guardians of a legacy. Meredith didn't even fully understand. They'd been trained to protect something buried, something unspoken. And when Shaq knelt, calm, open, unafraid, he'd shattered the ritual. He hadn't shown dominance. He'd shown truth. And that confused them, broke them, freed them. He folded the letter gently, placed it back in the envelope, and locked it in the drawer beside his desk. Not out of fear, but because the moment hadn't yet come. He needed more. He returned to the town archives the next morning. A cramped room in the basement of the Ridgeway Library. Mostly forgotten. Filled with rusted filing cabinets and dusty ledgers. The librarian, an older woman named Donna May, recognized him immediately. Looking for something specific, she asked. Tone polite but uncertain. Jeremiah Blake, Shaq said, watching her carefully. Her mouth twitched. Not in recognition. In discomfort. Old name, she muttered. Might be in the property transfer files. Try drawer C5. He did, and what he found confirmed everything. An ownership record from 1961. Jeremiah Blake, deed holder of parcel 12B. Transfer date, July 2, 1964. Buyer Langley Holdings. Sale price. No signature from Jeremiah. Just a stamp. Shaq photographed the document and left without another word. That evening, he called an elder he'd met during his early weeks in Ridgeway. A man named Eldon Reeves. Sharp-eyed, slow-moving, respected. He'd lived through the town's quietest storms. Kept his head down but his memory sharp. Shaq invited him for tea. No camera. No microphone. Just two men and the weight of history between them. I need to ask you something, Shaq said, laying the photo and the property record on the table. Did you know Jeremiah Blake? Eldon stared at the photo for a long time. His lips pressed tight. Then he nodded. I was 13 when they took him, he said quietly. They said he stole a radio. My daddy didn't believe it. Said Jeremiah made more in a week than that radio was worth in a year. But you didn't argue back then. Not with people like Walter Langley. Did anyone ever try to speak up? Shaq asked. Eldon looked out the window before answering. They tried. Once. A preacher held a prayer vigil outside the courthouse. Next Sunday, his church was burned. No one was ever arrested. Shaq felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Not like a burden, but like a responsibility. Like something sacred had been handed to him. Not to carry but to unearth. That night, he took the letter from the drawer again and read it beneath the porch light. The youth center stood quiet behind him, but he could feel Jeremiah there, in the wood, in the floorboards, in the laughter that still echoed inside. Shaq didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in echoes. He knew now, the story didn't start with him. It didn't start with the dogs, or the fence, or even Meredith. It started with a man named Jeremiah Blake, who dared to claim space, who dared to build, and who was buried, not in earth, but in silence. But not anymore. Shaq didn't know what would come next. Whether the town would listen, whether Meredith would face the truth. But he did know this. He wasn't here to kneel anymore. He was here to stand. Shaq had never been the kind of man who believed in confrontations for their own sake. He didn't go looking for them, didn't find satisfaction in cornering someone with truth like a weapon. But some truths refused to sit still. Some histories didn't rest, not even after generations of silence. And now the weight of a letter and a name, Jeremiah Blake, had grown too heavy to carry alone. So when the morning came clear and windless, when the youth center was still quiet with unopened blinds and unopened voices, Shaq walked to Meredith Langley's front gate and knocked. Not hard. Not loud. Once. The same gate that had swung open weeks ago to unleash fury, now creaked open under his hand. The dogs were nowhere in sight, though he could hear one pacing in the distance, its paws shifting restlessly across wood. Meredith didn't appear immediately. For a moment he thought she might not come out at all, but then the door cracked, and her figure emerged from the shadowed hallway, brittle but not frail. Her hands clutched the frame, her eyes scanned him. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was taut, stretched thin like a wire between rage and something older. Fear, maybe. "I have something for you," Shaq replied, holding out the envelope. "From your father." That made her blink. Just once. Then she stepped forward. Not all the way, not welcoming, but enough to reach for the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed the edge of the paper. She didn't open it. She stared at it, then back at him. He didn't leave anything to me," she said. Shaq didn't flinch. "He left this, for someone who'd find the truth." Her knuckles whitened around the paper. She said nothing more, just turned and walked back into the house, shutting the door without a word. He didn't follow. He didn't expect her to open it right away, or even in front of him. He just needed her to see it, to know. Because once truth enters a room, it doesn't leave the same way it came. By afternoon, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced across the sidewalks, chasing each other without pattern, like memories shaken loose. Shaq stood on the porch of the youth center, sipping lukewarm coffee, when he saw the curtain in Meredith's front window twitch. Just once. A flutter. A glance. It was the first time she looked at him without walls. By the next day her dogs had stopped barking altogether. Word spread in whispers, as it always did. Some said Meredith had locked herself in the house for hours after reading the letter. Others claimed she was seen weeping on her porch, whispering her father's name like a curse and a prayer. But no one knew for sure. What was certain, though, was that something inside her had shifted. 2 days later, she walked down her driveway for the first time in years. It was early, barely past sunrise, and Shaq was sweeping leaves off the youth center steps. She crossed the street slowly, deliberately. She carried no cane, no leash, just the weight of something unseen. He looked up when her shadow crossed his feet. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice was quieter than he remembered. Not weak. Hushed, like someone afraid to speak too loud for fear of waking the dead. Shaq nodded once. Most people don't. Until they do. She swallowed. "Jeremiah Blake. I thought he was just one of those stories people made up to make themselves feel better." "He was real," Shaq said, "and what was done to him was real too." Meredith didn't cry, but she folded her arms across her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. "My father told me we owned this land fair and square, that the people who hated us were jealous, that history would vindicate us." Shaq didn't say anything. He just let the silence sit between them. Heavy but honest. "I used to think those dogs were protecting me," she went on, staring past him. "But maybe they were guarding something else. Guilt. Or a grave." He glanced toward her yard. "They knew the truth before we did." A pause. Then Meredith did something no one expected. She stepped back just a little and asked, "Would you walk with me? There's something I need to see again." Shaq nodded. They walked in silence through the back gate of her property. The air behind the fence was cooler. the trees casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. At the far end of the yard stood an old shed, rusted, partially collapsed. Meredith led him there, her pace slow but steady. "My father used to come out here at night," she said. "He kept it locked, said it was just tools. But I remember the sound of hammering long after midnight. Inside, the air was stale. The walls lined with shelves, old paint cans, rope, tarps, and in the corner tucked behind a stack of weathered crates, a locked chest. Meredith handed him a key. "I found it in the attic, after I read the letter." Shaq opened the chest. Inside were papers, brittle deeds, grainy photographs, ledgers with names crossed out, and at the very bottom, a child's drawing, crayon on yellow paper, a house, a fence, and a smiling black man standing beside a sign that read, "Blake's Build and Repair." Meredith stared at it for a long time. "I must have drawn that," she whispered. "But I don't remember it." "Maybe your memory protected you," Shaq said. "But your hand remembered." They took the chest back across the street and set it in the youth center's library. Shaq didn't tell anyone yet. He wasn't ready to share the contents with the public, not until he could figure out what to do with the truth that had finally stepped into the light. Later that week, he invited Eldon Reeves to speak with Meredith. It was awkward at first, the stiffness of old age and older wounds, but once they sat, once Eldon pulled out his own memory, a hand-drawn map of Ridgeway from 1958, marked with all the black-owned homes that no longer stood, the air shifted. "I remember Jeremiah," Eldon said, voice clear. "He fixed our roof after a storm, refused to take payment, said we'd just pass it on." Meredith didn't interrupt. She just nodded, slowly, as if laying bricks in reverse, dismantling the house her father had built, not with hands, but with stories. The fence, once a fortress, began to rot in real time. Not from decay, but from disuse. The dogs no longer snarled. The sign had been taken down. One afternoon, a few kids from the youth center wandered too close. Meredith stepped out, not to yell, not to warn, but to hand them a basket of apples. No words, just the offering. Some in Ridgeway began to notice. A few neighbors stopped pretending not to see Shaq. A young couple brought their daughter to the center and stayed through the whole session. The librarian, Donna May, moved Jeremiah Blake's name into the official records and began building a small archive of Black Ridgeway history. It was quiet change, but real. Shaq never celebrated it. He didn't throw a rally or call a press conference. He simply updated the plaque on the youth center wall. It now read, "Dedicated to the builders, known and unknown." And as for Meredith, she stopped sitting behind windows, started showing up instead, sometimes with a bag of books, sometimes with a question, but always with that same expression, the one that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't pride either, something between. Awareness. Because she'd learned that the past isn't a chain to be broken, it's a weight to be carried. Together. A woman near the front gasped audibly. Two older men in the second row leaned forward, their faces tightening. One stood up and left before the letter was even halfway done. Another followed moments later, mumbling about things best left buried. Shaq didn't stop reading. When he finished, he set the paper down and stepped back. Silence followed, long and sharp. Then Eldon stepped forward. "I was there," he said simply. "I saw what they did to Jeremiah. I watched them steal his name from the town and put a white picket fence over his memory. I didn't speak then. I'm speaking now." His voice was rougher than Shaq's. Not less steady, just older, worn from years of holding too much. He told them about the Sunday vigil, about the burned church, about the day his own father came home with bloody knuckles and tear-filled eyes, whispering, "Don't let them see you cry. They feed off that." More silence. Then, a hand rose. It was Rosa Donnelly, the widow who ran the bakery on 5th Street. She stood with effort but spoke clearly. "My uncle knew Jeremiah. They worked together. He told me stories, but I never asked questions. I should have. I didn't want to stir things up. I thought time would do the healing, but I was wrong. Time doesn't heal lies. It protects them." Someone else rose, and another. A man named Hal Murphy, former high school principal, admitted that he'd heard rumors but always believed the Langley version of things. "I thought Jeremiah just moved away. I never asked why, didn't think it was my place." And just like that, the silence began to crack. Not everyone stood. Not everyone applauded. Some sat stone-faced, refusing to meet Shaq's eyes. A few scoffed under their breath. One woman near the back muttered, "We can't just rewrite history because it's uncomfortable." But her voice was drowned out by the next speaker, a college student home for break, who said, "We're not rewriting. We're uncovering." What began as a trial of one man's past became something bigger, a reckoning with collective memory. The room began to divide not by generations or race, but by courage. Those willing to acknowledge the truth stood with their shoulders a little straighter. Those who couldn't clung harder to the myth. And through it all, Shaq didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even move from his seat after the letter was read. His presence was enough. It reminded them what stillness looked like when wrapped in truth. By the time the meeting ended, night had swallowed Ridgeway. People filed out slowly, voices hushed, movements uncertain. No one shook hands. There were no back pats or congratulations, just the heavy hush of something irreversible. Meredith Langley was not in attendance, but her absence was louder than any voice in the room. The next morning, Shaq arrived at the youth center early. The sun hadn't yet burned off the fog. He noticed something different before he even reached the steps. A gathering of people across the street, near the Langley property. About a dozen of them, tools in hand, gloves, a ladder. He crossed slowly, unsure. Then he saw what they were doing. The fence. The towering, suffocating wall that had long been both boundary and barricade was coming down, piece by piece. Quietly, methodically. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a group of neighbors working with silent intention. One pried loose a plank, another collected nails. An older man carefully rolled up a length of warning tape that had been posted years ago. They didn't look at Shaq. They didn't need to. The act was the message. Meredith didn't come out. But the fact that the gate was unlocked, that no one stopped them, that said enough. She had given them permission. Or maybe she'd simply stepped aside. By afternoon, the fence was gone. In its place was a clear view of both properties. The youth center, vibrant and alive. The Langley house, old but no longer looming. Just a house now. Just history, not a threat. That evening, Shaq held an impromptu community circle on the cleared land. No speech, no spotlight, just folding chairs and shared space. Kids ran barefoot across the grass, laughing in the dusk. Eldon brought out a harmonica and played a tune no one recognized but everyone felt. A few townspeople brought candles. They didn't light them in protest, but in memory of Jeremiah, of truth, of stories once silenced, now being spoken aloud. Shaq sat among them, not above them. He passed around a copy of the letter, but didn't read it this time. He let them read for themselves. Let them decide. Some cried. Some stayed silent. Some simply held the paper like it was heavier than it looked. What had started as confrontation had become communion. Not the easy kind. The hard kind. The kind that asks something of you, that changes you, if you let it. Later that night, as he locked the youth center doors, Shaq turned to look one last time at the space where the fence had stood. It was bare now, open to the street, to the stars, to the future. The dogs were quiet, the wind was still, and for the first time since he arrived, Ridgeway didn't feel like it was bracing for him. It felt like it was listening. There was a different kind of quiet in Ridgeway now. Not the heavy hush of unspoken truths, not the tension that curled at the corners of conversations, but a softer quiet, the kind that settles after a storm, not because everything is fixed, but because something essential has been cleared away. The air felt lighter. The soil underfoot seemed less haunted. And where the fence once stood, casting its long shadow over both the Langley house and the youth center's back lawn, there was now light, space, possibility. Shaq started clearing the ground on a Monday morning. Alone at first. He took a spade to the dry earth, turning it over carefully, respectfully, like he was introducing it to a future it had never known. He didn't blast music, didn't announce the project. He just worked. A little each day, sweating in the sun, pausing often, letting the rhythm of rebuilding find its own pace. By midweek, the kids joined him, not because he asked, but because they watched. And when you're a child and you see someone quietly creating something, your instinct is to help. They brought their own tools, tiny plastic shovels, painted flower pots, seeds bought with pocket change. No one said the word garden out loud, but that's what it was becoming. They laid out beds of wildflowers first, the kind that didn't ask for permission to bloom. Then came vegetables, tomatoes, green beans, squash. Ellie, the youngest of the group, named a patch of soil Hope's Row, and insisted it grow sunflowers, and just beyond the vegetables, under the tree that had always leaned slightly to the left like it was listening, Shaq placed a stone, not carved, not chiseled, just a smooth, flat rock he found in the creek bed one morning. On it, painted in quiet white letters, were 2 words, Jeremiah's Field. No last name. No plaque. Just a name. A reclamation. The space transformed slowly, not with grand gestures but with care. Each shovel of earth was a refusal to forget. Each planted seed was a declaration that healing, if it ever comes, must grow. Brick by brick, flower by flower, it took form. One afternoon, as the kids painted a low stone wall with bright handprints and poetry quotes, a man from the town council stopped by. He didn't say much, just looked around for a while, hands in pockets, then muttered, "It's good, what you're doing." It was the most direct acknowledgement Shaq had received from any town official. He nodded once in return, not out of courtesy, but as a marker, one stone placed on another. That same week, a small envelope appeared in the youth center's mailbox. No stamp, no name, just a folded piece of stationery, with one sentence written in clean, trembling handwriting. "Thank you for not hating me." Shaq read it once, then tucked it into the back of his journal. He didn't need to ask who sent it. The weight of those words was enough. He didn't write back. Not because he was angry, not even because he didn't forgive, but because some wounds, the deep ones, the generational ones, don't need to be answered. They need to be honored. There's a difference. Forgiveness, he'd learned, wasn't always a conversation. Sometimes it was a boundary, a space left undisturbed, like a scar that doesn't ache anymore but still deserves its silence. Meredith wasn't seen for several weeks after the fence came down. Not at the market, not on the porch. Her curtains remained drawn, her dogs quiet. And then, one evening, just as dusk painted the rooftops gold, Shaq saw her from across the street, standing beneath the tree at Jeremiah's Field, hands clasped behind her back. She stayed there a long time, didn't move, didn't look toward the youth center, just stood. And when she left, she walked slowly, like someone who had carried too much for too long, and finally decided to set part of it down. The garden bloomed faster than expected. Kids began giving tours to newcomers. They told stories about Jeremiah like they had known him, not just because they read about him, but because they felt him. In the sunflowers, in the way the tree leaned, in the rhythm of something finally being set right. Shaq watched it all, not as a leader, not as a savior, but as a witness. And sometimes, late at night, he'd sit at the edge of the field with his journal and write down the names of things that were once broken but had been made whole. A cracked bird bath, now filled with rainwater and pebbles. A wooden bench, rebuilt by 2 teens who once couldn't sit in the same room. A friendship between Jace and Ellie that had started in argument and grown into laughter. Each entry was short, just a sentence, a record of small repairs. He never mentioned the town's shift in public, never demanded statues or speeches, or even an official apology. His work wasn't about that. It was about making sure that if a child wandered onto this field 5 years from now, they'd feel something different in the soil, something honest, something that whispered, "You belong." One Saturday morning, a group of local artists asked if they could paint a mural on the back wall of the youth center, the side that now overlooked the garden. Shaq gave them full freedom. They came back with a sketch, a long ribbon of faces, some real, some imagined, woven together in a single line, stretching across the entire wall. Black, white, brown, old, young, smiling, crying. At the center was Jeremiah, no halo, no crown, just a man standing beside a child holding a watering can. The mural took 3 days to finish. On the final afternoon, a group gathered to watch the last strokes. Meredith wasn't among them, but Shaq saw one of her dogs sitting at the fence line, calm, tail thumping softly in the grass. It stayed until the artists packed up, then wandered off toward home. The garden wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a living archive, a place where truth and hope could share the same ground, without choking each other out. Where stories once buried could be planted instead, grown wild and bright, tangled and true. And while Ridgeway wasn't fixed, no place is, not really. It was changed. Because healing doesn't begin when the pain stops. It begins when silence breaks. And when a man like Shaquille O'Neal decides not to tear down a town, but to build it, brick by brick in the name of someone who never got the chance. By the time the first cold winds of fall swept through Ridgeway, the story of Jeremiah's field had already drifted far beyond the borders of the town. The mural, the garden, the fence that came down, all of it had been captured in fragments. A photo here, a local blog post there, but none of it fully told the story of what was coming. Not really, because while Ridgeway was healing, Shaq was building something much bigger. Something rooted in the same soil but meant to reach places most people had long forgotten, or deliberately ignored. He called it Legacy Grounds. The idea had come to him not in a moment of inspiration, but in the slow rhythm of restoration. The way soil turns, how seeds sprout, how names once buried begin to echo again. It wasn't just about Ridgeway, it was about every town like it. Towns where history had been paved over with silence. Towns where families still whispered names they weren't allowed to mourn. Towns that needed more than apologies. They needed space. Space to remember, to rebuild, to speak without fear. Legacy Grounds would be that space. At its core, it was a network of memorial gardens, art spaces, and community centers planted in towns with long-forgotten racial histories. Places where injustices had happened and gone unacknowledged. Places like Ridgeway, where truth had been kept behind fences for too long. Shaq didn't announce it with a press conference. There was no PR rollout, no social media countdown. Instead, a single handwritten letter was sent to the editors of 5 major newspapers. It read, "We can't rewrite the past, but we can plant something new in the places where truth was pulled up by the roots. Legacy Grounds is for them, the silenced, the erased, the ones whose names didn't make it into the history books, but whose lives shaped the ground we walk on. This isn't about me, it's about memory, made visible." Shaquille O'Neal. That was all. One letter. But it caught fire. News anchors tried to frame it as a celebrity pivot, a reinvention. Commentators called it bold, unexpected, even radical. But those who had been watching closely, those who knew what Ridgeway had become, they understood it was none of those things. It was inevitable, because Shaq hadn't changed. He had simply decided it was time for the world to see the parts of him that didn't fit into headlines. The first Legacy Grounds site was announced at a town meeting not unlike the one where he'd read Walter Langley's letter. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no splintering, no gasps, just quiet anticipation. When Shaq stood up, he didn't hold a paper in his hand. Just a photo, the same one he had received months earlier. Jeremiah Blake, standing with pride in front of his workshop. He raised it once, said, "This is where we begin." And the room erupted in applause. Construction began that fall, behind the youth center, and stretching into the lot that had once belonged to the Langley estate. Meredith had quietly signed over the unused section of land. No press, no discussion, just a notarized letter left on the youth center's front desk with a sticky note that read, "It belongs to him anyway." Her signature was neat, fine. The new facility was modest. By design, a circular open-air pavilion, with engraved names spiraling outward in stone. The outer ring featured benches and planters filled by local students, each bearing a name of someone whose history had been uncovered through the community's ongoing research efforts. Not just Black Americans either, but Indigenous names, immigrant names, anyone whose story had been erased to make someone else more comfortable. At the center of the circle stood a single metal post wrapped in vines. Not a statue, not a monument, but a living symbol, one that would grow, evolve, change. Because the point was never to freeze history in place, it was to keep it moving. Shaq declined to put his name on anything. When a donor suggested naming the central pavilion after him, he refused. "This place doesn't need more names like mine," he said. "It needs names like his. Like hers. Like the ones you've never heard." But the world was watching anyway. Legacy Grounds received letters from communities across the country. Places like Pine Hollow, Georgia, where a family church had been burned in 1963 and never rebuilt. Alfred, Missouri, where a Black-owned grocery store had once stood until eminent domain had bulldozed it into a highway. People sent photos, deeds, oral histories recorded on cassette. The silenced, it seemed, had been waiting for permission to speak. Shaq listened to every voice. He created a rotating committee of elders, historians, artists, and local youth to review each proposed site. The idea wasn't to parachute in and fix places. It was to listen, to plant what the community needed, not what others thought they should want. By spring, 5 more locations had been chosen. National media wanted to make him the face of a movement. Anchors asked how it felt to be leading change. He always gave the same answer: I'm not leading, I'm holding the door open.
Ridgeway changed in the process too.
The youth center became more than a space for kids. It became a research hub, a team of volunteers led by Eldon Reeves, and a college professor who'd retired nearby, began collecting stories from local elders. They called the project Names Not Forgotten. By year's end, they'd documented over 200 individuals whose lives had been touched, twisted, or erased by Ridgeway's past. A reading was held under the tree in Jeremiah's field. One name at a time, spoken aloud, heard for the first time in decades. Not everyone embraced the change. Some residents moved, some shops stayed distant. But the current had shifted. You couldn't unhear what had been spoken. You couldn't rebuild the fence that had come down. Not when a garden had bloomed in its place. One morning, months into the Legacy Grounds launch, a young reporter asked Shaq a question that stuck with him. Do you think this is your legacy? He smiled. Not with pride, but with patience. No, he said. This is theirs. I'm just making sure they have somewhere to stand. And that, more than anything, was what shocked the world.
Not his size, not his fame, not even the viral moment with the dogs.
But his stillness. His refusal to dominate a narrative that was never his to begin with. His willingness to kneel when others ran, to listen when others shouted, to stay when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. Because what he did next wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet, consistent, grounded. And in a world built on noise, sometimes it's the stillness that shakes the ground hardest. They tried to bury the truth behind a fence. He turned it into a field. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Share it at the dinner table. Bring it up where silence usually wins. Because the world doesn't change when we repost it. It changes when we live like it already has.